if she wants to drop the net zero 2050 legal obligation, I actually would agree with that. I think we were wrong to put that into law for two reasons. One is that it is completely impossible to achieve. And we saw, and I guess we didn't quite realize at the time what an uphill mountain it was to climb. And we were adhering to a temperature target that had come out of the COP process that I have now realized was far more about politics than science. And also, no government has ever legislated for a long-term target like emissions reduction, not GDP, not defence spending, nothing. So I actually think the law as it stands is wrong.
Kemi Badenoch told Tory MP hopefuls, back net zero and I'll reject you. The Conservative leader this week said that even former ministers could struggle to meet her requirements for candidates at the next election if they back net zero. Now, this is interesting from Kemi Badenoch because, of course, under David Cameron, the Tories were very green indeed. They even changed their logo. David Cameron hugged a husky. And in fact, the Tories were very proud of the fact that emissions went down substantially under the last Conservative government and coalition. In fact, I think there's a statistic that said they were halved from 1990 onwards. We didn't quite have the culture war over climate change that we seem to have now. Perhaps it's a substitute for Brexit. Claire Perry-O'Neill is a former Conservative Minister of State for Energy and Clean Growth. She's an expert in decarbonisation, and indeed she advises and serves on the boards of leading global companies. In fact, she was the minister who pushed through the legislation that made the net zero target by 2050 a legislative, statutory requirement. And she joins me now. Welcome to the show, Claire.
Yeah, great to see you.
Tell me what you thought of what Kemi Badenoch had to say. Back net zero and I'll reject you.
Well, so great to talk about this. It's very topical, particularly as it's 32 degrees in Wiltshire and I don't have an air conditioner. I'm a bit unclear as to what she is objecting to. And just bear with me for a second because it's a little bit nuanced. If she wants to drop the net zero 2050 legal obligation, I actually would agree with that. I think we were wrong to put that into law for two reasons. One is that it is completely impossible to achieve. And we saw, and I guess we didn't quite realize at the time what an uphill mountain it was to climb. And we were adhering to a temperature target that had come out of the COP process that I have now realized was far more about politics than science. And also, no government has ever legislated for a long-term target like emissions reduction, not GDP, not defence spending, nothing. So I actually think the law as it stands is wrong. But what is not wrong is focusing on decarbonisation. Whatever the slogans, we can't cheat atmospheric physics. And I guess I would have expected from Kemi, who I think is a pragmatic leader, a proper conversation that says, look, the world is warming up. It is emissions related. That is obvious. Companies are continuing their climate journeys, even if they're not shouting about it. And as you say, I now spend most of my time in the private sector. Why? Because they see that there are huge risks to their operations and their supply chains from what's currently happening. And also there's lots and lots of money to be made. Decarbonisation, provision of energy, provision of electricity is the second fastest growing economic sector in the world after technology. So my advice to Kemi, as you said, is not to throw the net zero baby out with the anti-woke bathwater, but to exercise some pragmatic leadership that says, where is the UK's place in all of this? You know, the government is wrong to have this mad ban on North Sea hydrocarbon extractions. Why? Because we're just buying it from Norway, who are taking it out the other half of the basin. That's bonkers. We need tons of energy, all kinds of energy. How do we continue to exercise our leadership in thinking through what sensible emissions reduction looks like? How do we adapt to a really warming world? How do we double down on some of the technologies we're really good at, small nuclear, carbon removal, etc.? So I would have expected, Ed, a slightly more, like it was in our day, a slightly more nuanced and intellectual approach to what is a massive problem. And whatever Kemi says, whatever Donald Trump says, you can have a view on diversity policy. That's a political decision. you cannot cheat atmospheric physics. The world is going to warm up, and it will be much warmer in some places quite close to us. This isn't just a problem happening here far away. It's happening, as we can see, just across the oceans in southern Europe. And it's going to be particularly miserable for very large, very heavily populated countries, Bangladesh, India, and others that are much more unstable politically. And this is going to be a problem for us.
Yes, two former Cameroonian ministers discussing net zero. It will in no way trigger Times Radio listeners. But there's one key issue I really love your thought on, Claire, which is, on the one hand, I sort of admire Ed Miliband because he is a minister who, in this government, has an agenda and sees it through. What I can't get my head round is why he doesn't see the political Achilles heel of high energy prices. He would get more acceptance for his policies if he could also do them while lowering energy prices. Is that impossible for him to do, or is he just missing a trick?
So it's not impossible, and a couple of things. So policy certainty is a really good thing for business investment. I'm allowed to say I'm writing this book. It's called Get Real, How to Reset Your Corporate Climate Strategy. CEOs are prepared to invest a lot of money and stay in economies for a long time where there is policy certainty. And you're right, Ed has actually been very clear about what he wants, and we have seen record investment in our grids, in renewable energy, etc. The problem with energy prices actually is almost nothing to do with what our former boss used to call green growth. It's a lot to do with how we price our energy markets off gas. I love gas. Gas is a wonderful fuel for providing capacity when the grids get squeezed. Even with all this lovely sunshine, Ed, gas, I checked last week, was providing about half of the grid's generation capacity. Why? Because we all have turned on our power systems to try and cool down, and the wind isn't blowing very much, so there's not a lot of wind energy. So Ed should have done he did look at it. How do you reprice the energy system to stop pricing it off gas, which is a transitional fuel and also is very variable? I don't quite know why he hasn't pushed that through. I think it's because, as I remember from my ministerial days, you will too, sometimes trying to reform something as complicated as Wi-Fi for you, energy for me is extremely difficult, and you hear thousands of voices screaming at you saying why you can't do anything. And I think ministers should often, as you and I try to do, sometimes have the guts to do things that are difficult. So I think if he was able to say, look, we'll bring energy prices down, not by increasing renewables, which we will do, and that's a good thing, because we have, you end up having energy security, which people also care about, because I'm going to take this gas pricing issue on the chin. But Ed is also, Ed, and I say this with respect and affection, has been part of what I call the climate establishment for a really long time. And my observations as a minister and also as the first COP president for COP26 is that establishment thinks and breathes a very rarefied, pure air. And when you start to say, yeah, you know what, but actually you need gas, you need carbon capture, there are some people, not Ed, who I've had this conversation with, said, oh, no, we can't have any of that stuff. We've got to be pure. We've got to focus on emissions reduction. And you know what, Ed? There's no way we can cut emissions to get to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. So let's, as Kemi, I think, could do, deal with the world as we find it and not as the climate establishment would wish it to be. We ought to need to Greta Thunberg, and that has derailed us from real action, I think.
And can I quickly get you to put your former MP political hat on, just very quickly? I mean, there's something that I found pretty uncomfortable about Kemi Badenoch laying down the law about what potential Tory candidates could agree to. Although, having said that, I'd rather I do kind of favour party discipline, but there was something I thought rather mean about it.
Yeah, so I was a former whip. I don't know if you were a whip, weren't you?
I wasn't a whip. No one would trust me with a whip.
You're too nice. So I really like party discipline, and I actually used to advocate for removing the whip from the Spartans well before the Brexit referendum, and saying if you don't want to stand on the manifesto we were elected on, jog on and go and form your own party, whatever. I don't like this, you're in or you're out, it's black or white, because What you need is intelligent people who are prepared to look at something. This is a very complicated problem. Decarbonising the whole of the economy in a way that keeps prices down, maintains industrial investment is really tough. And having these litmus tests, Ed, I find really uncomfortable. The Tories have always been an intellectual broad church. Some might say too broad. And if you look at, your intake, my intake, we brought in a lot of people with very different views who I think did a damn good job in many cases.
Well, there you go. Claire Perry O'Neill, you've been a fantastic guest, and as I predicted, Times Radio listeners take all sorts of different views. Eileen says, what a wonderful guest, and Tom says, more rubbish from left-wing ESG Vaizey. They were attacking me, Claire, not you, so there you go. Claire Perry O'Neill, thanks so much for coming on the show, talking about Kemi Badenoch's announcement that if you back net zero, you cannot be a Tory candidate at the next election. Claire was the Conservative Minister for State for Energy and Clean Growth. And as she mentioned, she's got a book out later this year with the working title, Get Real, the CEO Guide to Resetting Climate Plans.